Welcome to the Revenue Rewired podcast, hosted by StringCan Interactive's visionary CEO, Jay Feitlinger, and no-nonsense COO, Sarah Shepard. We're here to accelerate your revenue and give your marketing purpose. Okay, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Revenue Rewired podcast. How are you, Jay? How's it going?
I am great. It's a little warm out there today.
Yeah, so we are in July in Phoenix, Arizona, which I think most people just think, oh, I'm so sorry for you. But
I'm
that's what we say
melting.
in December when we're like by the pool, so it's all good. All right, well, today we have a great episode for you all, the one KPI that aligns every department and why you're probably ignoring it. And this is very timely, I think, for a lot, including ourselves, a lot of businesses, because it's halfway through the year, which is insane. And a lot of organizations go through some sort of process, whether it's like quarterly planning or even sort of a biannual review. And we just wrapped ours up. And this is probably one of the things that continues to guide our process. We run on Pinnacle. We've been on EOS, whether you're on Gazelle or Metronomics or I don't know, Jay, what are the other systems? But
Scaling up. There's so many of them.
which is amazing. There are so many options, but I think they probably all have at least this in common. This is something I think that helps organizations who might be struggling with. We are so busy, we are so active, but things are not moving in the direction I want them to. And I think this helps tackle some of those blockages because alignment in this one area, and I know I'm really leading up, there's so much tension. What is it, Sarah? Uh, it's something that shockingly we don't see a lot of organizations provide us with this number. So, Jay, I want you to kick it off a little bit with, our quarterly planning process and maybe working backwards from that. Why is it that that's so important to help get departments aligned?
On the KPI side or just the planning side?
Just in general, because I don't know that a lot of organizations feel like they can afford the time to do this. I mean, we made that excuse early on where, and we did spend a lot of time because we manually did it ourselves. I can understand that. It feels like a lot of work, right?
Definitely. And I think, again, I know this show isn't about, promoting, an operating system like EOS or Metronomics or whatnot, but I want to give credit where credit's due. I feel like that process is what helped us a ton because when I reflect a bunch on, the first, I don't know, 8 or so years of our business before we started leveraging a platform like that, and all the past companies I've had that I've owned and or been part of, the quarterly planning process is one that I think is really challenging. First of all, I think let's recognize a positive. How many companies don't even do quarterly planning? Again, I'll admit, I've had numerous businesses where I did a really good job at like every December, I would plan out the next year. And then typically in November of the next year, I would look at my annual planning and see how I did. And again, just so many companies are like that where they just spend all this time planning out this amazing year and then no one invests energy around looking at and seeing, quarter by quarter how you're doing. And so I think back to your question, I think the biggest challenge that a lot of organizations have is, without giving direction and vision around like what true north is and what you're all trying to achieve against, the annual goal, everyone's going to come into, the quarterly planning process, those that are involved, and they're just going to be all over the place. And so again, this is why I love platforms like, EOS and Metronomics is it gives you a framework to work off of, almost like if you remember, I don't know if they have them anymore, but like the Mad Libs. Do you ever
Oh,
use
yeah.
it? Okay. I mean, I'm a huge fan of that when I was a kid and I loved it. Obviously, I got pretty naughty most of the time with the words I chose. But, again, there is a lot of benefit of giving someone a framework like that and just filling in the blanks versus being a blank canvas. So that's why I think it's just so important and so hard is without having something to work off of, you end up with like this massive wall of post-it notes of issues you have. And as I know, Sarah, you've seen this, but before we got really good about doing these kind of planning processes, I'll never forget, and to this day you still complain about it, is when someone had a post-it note about the temperature in our office or whatever the thing was that upsetted you that was so silly, but to that person was a pretty significant thing. And I blame us because we didn't give the people, the bumper lanes to work within.
Hmm.
By the way, what was that you were so upset? What was the thing? Was it temperature or
I
food
think
or
it
something?
was. It was the temperature of the snacks were not great or something like that. And
Yeah.
I was like, fine, you guys go buy your own snacks. Give me a list of what you want, what you're allergic to, and I'll make it happen.
Oh my God.
Um,
But
which,
reflecting that, don't you agree though, I think we should take some blame where when we get people giving us those random things, it's probably because we didn't do a great job at giving direction of what we're trying to accomplish so they can have some focus.
well, to be fair, issue is such a broad term. And now we've really, even our own leadership team has to develop the parameters around what is an issue? What is it really impacting? Like the why behind the why? So it might be so and so is not replying. Okay, well, what's the issue? Well, then the issue becomes 10 steps down the road, we won't hit our deadline. Okay, well, that's the issue is we won't hit our deadline because I can't hit a reply. And I think that really requires a lot of deep thinking, a little bit more strategic domino effect of like this causes this, the if this then that kind of situation, which is sort of why I started with asking you about quarterly planning versus like departmental um, situations because quarterly planning, I think Lencioni has that the great book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, where he
Great
mentions
book.
like the whole planning process and why. And we've read that book multiple times in this organization because it is a classic. It's a great book. And it really shows the power of alignment from the top. And I'd say, even if your organization is struggling to find the time to make the time, there is benefit in pausing for just a moment and reevaluating. I mean, I think I just wrote about this in my newsletter where you have to give yourself space to see if something is still working because we are so habitually good at finding a routine and sticking to it. It's rare someone will stop to question their routine. Is this still a good thing? Uh, I think parents are good at this because their children evolve in a way that they have to follow along and find new routines, new sports, new classes. And so if you're not in that sort of check yourself at a certain period, maybe it's quarterly, there really isn't a good reason for you to stop and evaluate what's working and what isn't. And, we've found so many organizations that struggle to make the time and make it important to do quarterly planning, even if it's just for a couple hours. It's amazing the conversations like we have with the team over a space of 2 hours where we connect, we really see what is impacting other people. It's a conversation about the business. So we're not in the business, we're talking about the business as a collective group. And I think giving people a voice helps re energize them. And that's probably one of the biggest ahas for me when we do this is it re-energizes people and you get more spaces of momentum than you would if you only do it once a year or not at all.
Yeah, and I think Sarah, I want to make sure it's clear because the one thing I do want our listeners to understand is not to oversimplify the the process because again if I am not doing quarterly planning today and I just heard you say 2 hours I'd be like, oh, easy peasy. But I
Hmm.
wanted to say there's some genius in the process that you've evolved over the years, and I even get excited about it. And I love that actually you own it and not me because it allows me to think about things differently and not try to over facilitate or over engineer the questions and or the answers. But I think what you do a really good job is, and it's very subtle, is which again I know we're going to talk about here in a second about like the main focus around the one KPI, is you do a really good job at framing up the questions in a way to again give us the lane to work within. And again, like for this quarterly planning, what I loved about it is it's like, okay, from a revenue perspective to be elite and to help us hit our goals and reminder here what the goals are and whatnot, and we can obviously talk about that. It allows me to understand the kind of feedback you're looking for. And so I think by you doing the questions to each person, have individually people submitting their answers, and then you analyzing that and you frame up our perspective from an ownership point of view against all of their feedback. And then we have the 2 hour meeting where we kind of regroup and you kick it off and kind of share what you've heard. And then we have conversation. It's one of my favorite meetings we have every quarter because even with the ones like this quarter when we talked, it wasn't all roses. We had some hard conversations this quarterly planning because obviously the world is really scary out there sometimes. And I think though that it significantly reduced the stress, but also made people feel heard. And that's the part that I really enjoy about our quarterly process. I feel like we've nailed it. Where every quarter we do this, it gets better and better.
And I think, I'm going to drop the number. It really is tied to all of it, ties to revenue. What is our goal? And we, as an organization, have our annual revenue number, but we consistently revisit the quarterly revenue goals. It is amazing to me how many clients we've had that don't either have insight or don't have this number handy. For us, it's always been part of like our culture that we've been very transparent with this number. And I think part of that is I do want to address the elephant in the room is there can be debate on that number and how you share it. But I'd love from like an owner perspective, what is it that made you comfortable in sharing what your revenue goals were with the company?
Wow, I have a couple thoughts there, so I'll try to be succinct. I think again, first of all, I wasn't always an owner of businesses, so I have been an employee. I don't think I'm employable anymore at this point, because I think I'd be the worst employee ever. But when I think back to being an employee, kind of a cog in a wheel, um, I never understood why I was given the goals I was given. And so I
Mm.
just had a manager just tell me to do X, and I just did those things mostly out of fear of losing my job. And then the other part of it obviously was, the compensation I got for me, pretty much always trying to achieve my goals. And so I think I have a lot of perspective from that point of view where I just, without knowing the why and what we're trying to accomplish, I just don't understand the true value that I'm bringing. And I think that the kind of people that we hire that are also very values oriented. And so putting myself in their shoes, our team members are smart and they can see when we're stressed, and obviously when we're doing great, we're celebrating that. But when we're stressed, a lot of, I think, business owners, they worry that if they show that fear, it's going to scare everyone off, and not only is it going to hurt the work they're doing on behalf of their customers, worse, they might lose some really good people. And I just have found that, over the years, again, I think people really appreciate the transparency to talk about the elephant in the room, and then to remind them what the vision is, and then to communicate where they can offer value to help as a team, as a unified front, how we can all be impacting that revenue. So that's why, I've never been uncomfortable with this. Obviously there are some elements of our financials that I don't love sharing, because I think it's because a lot of times people can't really impact things like on the profit side. There's so many business expenses that we have that no one on our team has an opportunity to change, and or often we don't want them to. Like we may make a decision that we want to give people big bonuses or take the team on a really cool, team bonding experience. That's a level one decision from an ownership perspective that we don't want to have to get buy-in on. And so that's why I think some areas of the financials, if they don't have any opportunity to make an impact to it, those are the ones I'm a little less comfortable to share. Not because I'm afraid of sharing the scary stuff, but just I'm afraid of sharing things that just cause unnecessary stress. But I have found more often than not the right people, if you hire the right people, when we present this stuff in the right way, I feel like it's a lot more positive than negative. And I know a lot of organizations don't share this. Again, to your point a few minutes ago, We have a lot of clients when we talk to them about, hey, what is your goals this year? And they're like, well, last year the goal was 5 leads per week from marketing to sales, and now it's probably going to be 6. And then if we ask why, they're like, well, we just want to do more. There's like no story around it, which clearly articulates to us that the leadership team is not either comfortable and or trusting their mid-level management team on what they're trying to accomplish. So I just wish that more businesses were a lot more open about this and why.
Yeah, and I think you just touched on the part of departmental KPIs. They become in like the visual in my head was they kind of can spider web out if there's no control or sort of bumpers like we've talked about the bowling bumpers because we've had lots of super smart people and we have lots of smart people and they care a lot about the work that they're doing. And while we do a good job of making sure people aren't super siloed, it's inevitable that you focus on your sort of core area of expertise, right? But with that, there also comes a little bit of blindness to other departments. Like I really have to think holistically when I filled out the quarterly reflection form of all the departments and what good things and opportunities presented themselves. But I don't know that that's as easy because that would be quite a lot, I think, for someone to like read into your world and my world and marketing and sales. And are they in service and customer experience and operations and finance? Okay, so naturally, they're departmentally minded. They're thinking about their worlds, where the organization then provides sort of like an umbrella and a little bit of a framework in order to be more successful. So, like the 80/20 rule, they kind of harness that energy and that drive into the areas that drive impact, mainly being revenue. That should be the one number that aligns everything. And then you would work backwards by department. So your department still could want to improve leads, but then they need to do a harder look at is that going to drive revenue or is that still just driving traffic and noise and I think that's where the department versus the company needs to have a little bit more openness and transparency and some sort of structure. And we've done
Yeah.
that before and we found it almost if you remember a couple years ago when we did sort of everyone kind of came up with their departmental goals, how overwhelming it felt. It felt like putting 10 pounds of potatoes into a 2 pound sack.
Yep.
And it was so hard. But then if you're aligned around revenue, everyone sees it's like the Super Bowl for us. Sorry, sports metaphor.
I get that part.
I know you got the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl for us is hitting this number and why are we hitting that number? And so sharing that with the team, like the why behind it, because then everyone can really align their efforts. And it's like you say everyone's rowing in the right direction. You get a lot more momentum. A team that's rowing in the same smooth way goes a lot further, a lot faster, and with a lot more ease. It does feel like I hear a lot of our clients struggling with activity is not equaling impact because of something as simple as a revenue KPI.
Yeah, I mean, I,
Mm.
I love where you're going with that, Sarah. And I think, again, reflecting as you were talking a little bit, I'll never forget. I was sitting kind of like in a business owner roundtable. God, this was before COVID, so this was probably, gosh, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, I guess it was maybe. And I brought up this topic that you're introducing right now about, the whole thing around setting goals. And we were going around the room, and I was one of the last to speak, and then all the business owners were talking about, okay, the goals, the KPIs for my ops department is, like accounts receivable, accounts payable. It's like all just typical tactical things that every department makes sense. And then, everyone was talking like about all these KPIs, and I was overwhelmed. It got to me, and partly out of frustration and partly out of I thought I was smart. I said, I think honestly, you're all wrong. I think every single one of you, that it should be about revenue. And then, of course, everyone started debating, well, accounting can impact revenue. And I'm like, well, they can. because, again, from a brand perspective, how they're communicating with your customers and how they're dealing with the invoicing, it just all the touch points, it impacts retention. And so we started having this interesting debate about like, okay, it's not really about the actual revenue part. It's more about giving people clarity. And that's why when I talked a little bit before about like why I love platforms and methodologies like EOS, is I just find that we're all just so busy and we're overwhelmed, especially in the agency world. And we have so many different clients in so many different industries. And it's just, you don't know what fire we have to put out at any given day because we're responsible for helping our clients achieve their goals. And when you have so many different things coming at you, it's really hard to come up with the individual departmental goals. And I just love that for many years now, we always ask the question about, okay, love that as far as an action or a goal, but tell us how it impacts revenue. And if the answer is it doesn't, it just gives you so much more clarity to just be like, okay, well, should we be focusing on that or not? And I know some things are really hard to always attribute to exactly how it generates revenue. Like, for example, like, making a new page on a website. If it's not a sales oriented page, you might be like, well, is it worth the extra hour or two to do that? But if there's a reason why you're doing it to help address, the whole revenue cycle, then I think it makes sense. And so, I'm not saying that the actual hitting the numbers is not important. Obviously, it's very important, but I think it's almost more important that by having you align your departments and your company goals against that revenue number and the why behind it, I just think it gives everyone so much more clarity around where they should be focusing on and not and or not what they should be focusing on. I think it's super powerful.
So it does sound like, okay, that's great. You guys are saying revenue, focus all your departmental goals, like this one KPI. It makes sense. However, it's not easy. And if it were, everyone would do it. So, what is it that we could help our listeners do to kind of like backwards engineer uh, an easy way to develop a revenue driven KPI that they can share with their organizations? And I know a lot of like really large organizations do a good job if they're like getting ready to IPO or something like that. Like it's all hands on deck. And typically, they do a good job of getting there because it's so singular minded that absolutely no fat is allowed. Nothing is allowed that does not directly impact that particular goal, whether it's, a revenue number to be sold or whatever. What is it that we've helped our clients do to kind of figure out what it is that they need in terms of revenue? And then we kind of like work our marketing magic into how strategy and tactics can kind of impact that down the road. But obviously, without a revenue number, it's really hard to get a lot of their internal systems and partners on board.
Well, I guess my question back to you first would be is, are we assuming that the actual revenue numbers are clear?
Well, we've had a lot of, especially business owners, they enjoy their business. They've started a business. They love helping their clients. And it's not always about the revenue. And I think there is maybe a little bit of weirdness with like, oh, I don't want my business to be about that number. But it is a KPI that drives pretty much everything you're going to do. But how do they kind of like pick a number? You've worked at organizations where they just threw a number out there.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's one of my least favorite thing, which is why, again, that was kind of a leading item. But again, it just blows my mind about how many times, if we're not working with the owner, working with like a chief marketing officer or chief revenue officer or VP of sales or marketing, whatever it might be, it's very apparent to me that the larger the company gets, the less, unless they're a public company, if they're a private company, the less they're aware of the actual vision and why. So I think to answer your question, I'll probably go downstream a little bit and focus on companies that are maybe a smaller, that maybe they're $50 million or lower, and the lower we get, the easier it gets, and or if we have access to the owner. But your question, it made me think about a story about a year ago, where one of our clients, actually, it was more like a couple years ago, but one of our clients hired me to help him do a quarterly planning on the marketing and sales side. And I did like a 3-day retreat for him. You probably remember the story.
Hmm.
And when I was talking with him, and he did actually have some equity or ownership in the company, so he did have some better visibility than often that role might have. And one of my first questions was like, okay, and this, let's say it was 2023, whatever. What is your goal, for next year? Because we were in Q4 planning for next year, and he's like, I don't know. We want to go from 42 million to 45, and he couldn't articulate the why. So what I did with him, that's for him was hugely valuable, is I kind of did this like paint a picture exercise. And so what I did was I kind of reverse engineered it. So I said, okay, let's fast forward a year from now, and let's focus on 5 initiatives that you've accomplished or addressed or solved, and let's talk about the why. And like he had one thing where he wanted to add this new product offering, and so we talked a bunch about what that would take as far as the number of people he would need, and the kind of profit and revenue it would drive, and we just kept on having those kind of conversations. And then what we did was we used those initiatives, then come up with how much revenue would be needed to then, fund all these great ideas. And so then we basically had a real life situation of, okay, well, end up being, I don't know, let's say it was $2.5 million to fund these initiatives. And then it was talking about, okay, well, assuming that the funding was there and you did this, then looking forward now 3 years out, what does this mean to the business? And he just lit up. It's like we've employed 120 more people. We launched a new location. We actually expanded finally into this new market. Like it was all these really exciting things. And so we ended up actually with this. Okay, now we actually have a number, and we added a little stretch goal because he was very competitive. And now we had this number. And the best part about it was I was invited back into their executive meeting a few weeks later, where he basically was presenting this because he wanted my help with presenting the marketing plan of it. And I literally was like almost crying in this meeting because he was articulating it, and I saw him do it the prior year. So I had that context of before and after. And this time he started out by painting this picture and like talking both about missed opportunities they had because they hadn't done some of these things I've been talking about for freaking years, and the new stuff. And then when he presented the revenue goal and then tied it back into the whole entire story, everyone in the room was like, done. Yes, let's do it. Because he had a vision. And that's the part that I think is so important, where it's like, when we talk down the tactical level of, like, an example I gave a little bit ago about going from 5 leads to 6 leads a week, what does that one extra lead mean? And if the answer is because I was told to, that's not, I mean, obviously that's fine. It's very normal. But if the answer instead was, we need to add 33 more people and we need to generate this more profit because we want to acquire a new company to expand in this market, and there's a story behind it, now all of a sudden everyone understands, okay, it's not just about the revenue number per se. The revenue number gave us the clarity on what we should focus on. Instead, now it's everyone's thinking about, brainstorming ideas that kind of gets you one step closer. And that's why I love, again, back to your initial question on quarterly planning. It's like, it's 25% gets you closer to your goal if every quarter you're focusing on the right things.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think revenue is such a smart goal. Well, I hope this episode was very helpful for everybody, because activity looks great on a report, but revenue looks really good in your bank account. So,
Oh, I love that.
uh, yes. And we are always open to any questions because we don't want to oversimplify any of this. It's taken us years to perfect these processes. And, we're always open to helping people accelerate figuring out how to do this for themselves. So you can reach us at podcast@stringcaninteractive.com. And thanks, Jay. Another great episode in the books.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Revenue Rewired podcast. Send us your questions to podcast@stringcaninteractive.com and follow us for more insights to drive your business forward.